Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today are term sheets and term sheet negotiation, really getting a little bit in the weeds, because I feel like every entrepreneur needs to understand the terms and understands. It gives you a chance to learn how I think about things or thought about things for 20 years as a VC. And then we're going to talk a little bit about cap table mechanics, but not a ton. I sent you a spreadsheet. Hopefully everybody got a chance to play with it. What I found is my work in the spreadsheet on here, the numbers are so small, people can't really see it. So I give it to you and we'll talk a little bit about it, but we don't have to spend a lot of time on it. And then lastly, talk a little bit about valuation, but as you'll see, there's no magic formula to tell you what valuation is. But the objective here really, and sorry if this is hard to read, is in my mind is so that you can understand how investors think about terms, including valuation, so you can have a productive and principled negotiation with them and not blow it through during that time by focusing on the wrong thing, either blow it with something you'll regret in the future or it hurt the relationship. So everybody know you've heard about term sheets. Everybody wants a term sheet, but what is a term sheet? It's a template for the final detailed docs. Essentially, it's the guide, the instructions for the attorneys to build a set of docs and documents that can be, really thick and not everybody reads. But pretty much everything controversial or important should be in the term sheet. It's not final, but it's a reference point for negotiations later. If something says it's one way in the term sheet and you want to change it, it's kind of a big deal on both sides. So I said, well, that's not a term sheet. We've been working on this for 30 days. We spent $50,000 to, all told, both sides together on attorneys, and now you're going to change something that might be important to me. It's not a good look for either side to start changing things in the term sheet. So it behooves the entrepreneur to be really careful and thoughtful as they negotiate and look at the term sheet. And finally, it's just sort of general advice, and I think I made Sarah do it, but there's a whole bunch of documents that are generated from the term sheet and the financing. And at this point in my career, I just look at, I don't look at all of them. I know which ones to look at, but every entrepreneur should read every word of them at least once and ask the attorney, because it's part of what you live with if you're going to be an entrepreneur, is seeing financings and understanding all the nuances around a financing. So VCs can offer a long form or a short form term sheet. I've seen both. On the West Coast, I've seen shorter term sheets because people tend to have more experience and you don't have to list all the details. For years, Mercury, we had a very long term sheet because we had a lot of times the people we were working with would have attorneys that would not necessarily be experienced in venture capital. And so we wanted to put everything out on the table and started. It led to kind of a longish process, but we felt like it resulted in a better outcome once you got through that first process. But there are shorter term sheets. We're going to go through a term sheet in detail, and it's a longer term sheet. So it's one of the longer ones. It's longer than the ones we used to have. But and finally, I would say attorney experience matters. And this is, to me, I generally work with lawyers that only do venture capital financings on this sort of thing, not corporate lawyers that do a whole bunch of other things. And yeah, I've done some venture capital financings because the deals look almost exactly alike. If I go to one set of lawyers that I use and then go to another one, I can almost take the documents and do a diff on the files and see that the differences are the things that are listed in the term sheet as being different. But most of the basic boilerplate is there. And that's great if you're doing a deal with somebody in the middle of the country or here. It means there's nothing weird about it. And then if you do a later round with a large VC that will come in and rewrite everything if it's not done correctly, it means you've already kind of done the basics and your documents won't change very much from financing to financing. There's a lot of efficiency in that. So that's sort of high level intro to what a term sheet is. Has anybody ever received a term sheet and reviewed a term sheet? Okay, so you've seen them then.
Dan, I got a question.
Yeah.
How many deals get lost if let's say on 75 there's some kind of percentage? Oh,
Good question. How committed is the VC is one thing you can ask. You can say, hey, thank you for the term sheet. How many, when you're at this stage, how many, what's your close percentage? And it can be different. I've seen it depends on economic, macroeconomics and the fund philosophy, the industry. I think in life sciences, it's usually a pretty high percentage get closed. But it could be that the VC still has a lot of diligence to do, and maybe that diligence is expensive. So they want to get the terms down before they spend $100,000 with a consultant or a laboratory test or something to confirm that they want to go forward. So why not shake out to see if we have a deal before spending that capital at risk? So I think that my experience is most investors are pretty open about this issue. We probably for many years, we were probably closer to the right-hand side. We took a long time to make a decision, but as if the market's a little frothier, where there's a lot more competition for the deal that we like, we might move faster, and but there might be more diligence items that could cause us to fall out. And sometimes you fall out because of detail that that pops out of the term sheet that doesn't quite get resolved, but that's more rare. Now we'll talk about it, but nothing's binding at this point. So you can walk all the way till you sign the final documents. And typically we give entrepreneurs a week to respond. But if people get really stressed about this, and I always tell CEOs, don't be stressed about it. If you need more time, and tell the VC, hey, I'm working, we're working through it. Our attorney's backed up. Whatever the situation is, just be open. We can always get another week. It's almost never a problem to get more time. What's the problem is if you don't respond and you just sort of let it sit. They sort of wonder if, okay, does he or she have 3 or 4 term sheets that they're evaluating, or are we just a stalking horse for someone that they're waiting for? So communication is good. The week is just to prompt you to communicate. So I sent you a legal document that's from the National Venture Capital Association, and one might assume that they're one-sided and they're writing term sheets that the only VCs like, but I think the term sheet's pretty middle of the road, although kind of longish. Did y'all get a chance to look at it? What I want to do is pull it up and just go through the important points. And I sent you a file where I had highlighted the things that I thought were interesting, and in yellow, and the things I thought were awful in red, and then some other things I want to talk about. But I want to go through it, and then we can talk about each of the terms so that you feel conversant in that. Okay, yeah, can you page through it maybe? Can you put it up, and then I can just say page forward and page backwards?
There.
All right.
Is this okay?
Yeah. So,
Okay, so let me just reshare.
the only thing that's binding, and you can pull up your version if you want. Okay. The only thing that's binding is the no-shop confidentiality provision. Everything else can be changed. So once you sign it, you're agreeing that you're not going to take it and show it to somebody else. You're not going to accept an offer. Somebody gives you an offer. A lot of times these no-shop require you to report that if someone else gives you an offer or another term sheet, you have to report it. It doesn't mean you can't. I've never seen anybody enforce this, but if you violate this, VC will walk from the deal, and they will not ever do a deal with you. And I think that's it's sort of a trust thing. And I don't think I've seen it happen maybe once where the entrepreneur did that and you found out about it, and it's a small world. So I would advise entrepreneurs not to be pretty thoughtful about the no shop here when they sign on it. It's just a bad look, and it's a bad start to a relationship if they're shopping it. It's okay if you have a term sheet to tell someone that before you sign it, to tell someone else, hey, we've got I feel like it's okay to say, hey, we've got an incoming term sheet. We're going to have to go quiet. But after that, you have to kind of say, wait for, if there's other term sheets you're waiting for, wait for them to come in. If you have executed it. Next page. Okay. I just highlighted the condition to closing. There's a whole bunch of things that you have to obtain. Everybody has to do this together. So I put in gray because it's really not important. People might focus on it as, oh, well, do I want that in or out of conditions to closing? Everybody's motivated to get closed. I don't worry about that one at all. Does everybody understand pre-money and post-money valuation? Have you had a discussion on that? I mean, just simple
That's it all the way back in January.
yeah. So nobody thinks about how much percentage you're buying. They look at it, but they think about in terms of pre and post money valuation. So if your pre-money is 10, you raise 5, your post money is 15, 10 plus 5 is 15, and investor owns a third because 5 is 1/3 of it. And all of the options and founder shares and everything have to go into the 2/3 side, which is the 10, the pre. And that sort of sets your math. And we'll talk a little bit about valuation. I think people focus way too much on this, and that's sort of a common theme through this discussion. And we can talk a little bit about the trade-offs here. So let's go next page. Dividends, cumulative dividends. I've never seen a company pay dividends in 20 years. So I don't even know why this is in here. It seems like it's like an artifact from the ancient history of venture capital at some point. And later stage deals, you can get creative financing that, because of situations that companies have and sort of their valuation and their cap table and various constraints on the financing, I can see this happening in late stage financing. But honestly, I've only had one company where that had a cumulative dividend, and we had to get rid of it because it was crushing the entrepreneur. A cumulative dividend means the dividend accumulates like compound interest. It doesn't sound like much, but 8-10 years later, it takes a while. It becomes a very large part of the company, and it comes out of the founder's portion, really. And later investors will either ask for it, which makes it worse because you have more money compounding, or they'll hate it and it has to get removed, and then you have to go back and negotiate it out and give the VC something for taking it out. So I don't worry about the dividends except for this. This is a red flag. So we're going to just keep going down. Liquidation preference. Everybody understand liquidation preference? So it's really pretty simple. It tends to be last money in is the first money out. And so the investors get their money out at least, and the founders sort of sit in the back of the bus. And only if you raise enough to pay everybody back do the common stock or the founders get money in most startups. And that's pretty normal. But there are situations where you can have very aggressive liquidation preferences. And this is one of the places that I think deserves a fair amount of negotiation, because again, like the cumulative dividends, if you give up a non-standard liquidation preference to get a higher valuation, for instance, the next person will ask for it, the next person will ask for it. It can have a much greater effect on your outcome than the valuation. Let's go next page. Yeah.
Two things. Do you want to maybe explain that liquidation preference a little bit further on how that's affecting the math? And then
yeah. Well,
also,
let's say that you raised you're a therapeutic company and you raised $50 million, and you sort of stumble a little bit, and somebody comes and acquires you and $50 million at $100 million valuation. So the investors own a third. You stumble a little bit, you have to sell, you get acquired for $40 million. The investor gets all of it because they get the first $50 million off the table. If you get acquired for $1 billion, well, it doesn't matter. The liquidation preference doesn't matter at all. but it's really safety in case the exit is so low that the investor gets that first slice of the capital. Now, there is something called participating preferred. So participating preferred means that the investor gets both. They get their capital back, they get their $50 million back, and then they get a third of what's left. And that sounds aggressive, but if let's just say I'm the first investor in your company, and I put in $5 million on a $10 million free, and you sell it for $15 million. Well, I've helped you create that $10 million of value because nobody would have bought it for the $10 million. That value, actually the $15 million of value, but I get no increase in the value of my stock because the post money valuation and the exit number are the same. This is an extreme example. So as an investor, I'm thinking, that's not really fair. You used my capital to create enough value, took an early exit. I didn't get paid very much. If I got anything, it's a very low multiple. And the founder got this pretty life-changing amount of capital. I should participate in that. And that's the VC point of view. I think this kind of comes and goes, participation or not. My view, it's not that important as for an investor because investors should be looking at the upside and how to make it a really big company and not so worried about the downside. But I think we're probably run about 50-50. What do you think, Sarah? 50-50 on participation and non-participation?
Yeah, I mean, I think it had been trending towards non-participation, but I was actually curious if you've seen any more recent terms go the other way.
I haven't seen anything recently to know. Yeah, it sort of depends on how much power the entrepreneurs have, but I think there's a principled reason for the VCs to want it, and they're not being. It's not being super greedy; it's being cautious. But I think it's often something that VCs will give up. However, if you believe you're going to create a billion-dollar company and you've got, participation, is it going? It only hurts you if you raise a really large amount of capital. You raise hundreds of millions of dollars to get to that. Then the participation will take a bite out because they'll get that slice off the top, and then they'll get their percentage of the remaining distribution. I'd probably prefer, if I'm an entrepreneur, I prefer not to have it. But I also see that we've been in economic times where it's just simply standard. So,
Dan, I've got a question on that. So do you see the participating term being imposed more at earlier stages and maybe not as much at later?
no, if you give it away in an earlier stage,
Well, then you're done,
every
right?
future investor will get it. Okay, so what you would like to do is not give it away at the early stage. Again, this isn't a hill worth dying on, in my opinion. But don't give it away at the early stage, and even for the later ones. Now this is more of an investor's view because you don't care, but investors would like everybody to be pari passu, which means that all the investors get their liquidation preference at the same time, rather than Series D and Series C. Then they all sort of split what's there if there's insufficient to convert them. But that's not real. That doesn't really affect the founder very much.
And I have one other question too.
Okay.
What are you seeing as the normal conversion multiple? 1x or?
Well, 1x. Okay,
No, on the participating with.
Yeah,
they have-
okay.
Of course, I'm jumping ahead because I'm talking
Okay.
about.
All right, so there's two things here, and I'm happy to go drill down. Thank you for asking the question. There's two things here. One is can be a multiple on the liquidation preference, like you get 2x the money that you put in. That's very aggressive, and I would never want to give that up at the early stage. Like I said, you get to a later stage deal, kind of financings can get funkier because you've got different objectives, and we won't worry about that here. But in the early stage, I think there's no reason for a VC to ask for a multiple liquidation preference. I think it's a bad idea to give it. If that's the only way you can get money that's your decision, but I hate it. And I think it also demotivates, starts to demotivate the team, and it's also every dollar you bring in it later is going to ask for the same thing. So I think it's problematic. Now, you also see something that looks very similar on participation, where you get a cap on participation at 2 or 3x, which means that participation that I've talked about, where you've got this sort of, you get your liquidation preference, then you get a slice of it, what essentially is the common stack, is you don't get that slice if the whole return, the entire return, is large enough. And so it goes away. And I think that's actually a nice negotiation tactic. If somebody wants participation, their reasons, like I said, are to protect themselves in the case of kind of an early exit. That's the principal reason. That's not the only reason. The other reason is just to get more money out. But the principal reason, in my opinion, is to get an early exit, is to protect an early exit to make sure they get capital. So you say, okay, let's put a cap on it. And your attorney, if you have a good attorney that understands this business, that's what they'll say is, okay, if you make 2x your money, then the participation portion goes away. And so that they either in that case, then they either have to, they would just convert to common, and there will be none of this slice off the top for preferred, because they would make more money by converting to common.
Yeah. Okay, I want to emphasize that last point in case you guys didn't catch it. So that conversion to common, if you read alternative 1, which is the non-participating, you would read it, you might be confused because you're like, well, it says that they don't get to participate at all, right? But the investors always have a right to convert to common. So when it's to their financial advantage, at the moment that you sell the company, for example, and exit it, they'll be like, yep, it was all common stock now. And that's how that document will be structured. And so they always contain that right. And what they'll do is they'll do what's called a waterfall analysis. They'll figure out what point it's worth it to them to convert that. That's just so you know, that's inherent in the structure of this document.
Yeah.
On their right to do that.
Yeah. So again, I've been this full participation can be modified to this cap on participation. And I'll tell you, I've seen the language here a little bit different in these terms, that a lawyer really sometimes has to read it to explain it to me who gets what. I've seen it sort of oddly phrased in a few sentences here. So your lawyer will help you with that. But I'm not a fan. I'm a fan of, hey, you want participation? Great. Let's make it go away after 2x or something like that. It's still something that you might. It might bite you if you raise a ton of money at a later stage and then have an exit that's not a multiple of that. But okay, so next, let's keep going. Next page.
Can I ask
Am I driving it here?
one question?
No, I think you're driving it. I'm not. Okay. No, that way back to the start. Maybe I did that. Let's scroll down. Liquidation preference. Okay, yeah, just pull that up to the top. Voting rights up to the top. Okay, voting rights. This is the portion that defines who is going to be on the board. And a lot of times it's important to I think the board is actually maybe in a different section. This is basically says who's going to elect. The voting rights section of the voting rights document is something that you absolutely should read. Has the board control. One of the things I wanted to say, I think it's in here later, is a lot of times the founder is the CEO, and the CEO is a board seat as long as they're the CEO. So I'm not saying that this is wrong, but if you're no longer the CEO, do you have a board seat? Is a question. Should you have a board seat? I don't know, but that's a lot of times sometimes there's a founder seat or a common seat, and that may go away over time as new investors come in and a lot of people around the table. A lot of times, a scientific founder, especially, would be an observer. They don't add as much to the business decisions, perhaps the financing decisions and all of that. They're still valued, but I think as a founder, you should be aware that if you're seeing the CEO seat, that designation is very often for the current CEO, not for you if you get moved to a different position. Protective provisions. These are provisions that I think arise historically over time as people found that tried to stop manipulation of the company or the stock that hurt investors. For instance, issuing more shares to themselves. The CEO, the board is one investor. I've aligned with the other board members. We're going to issue ourselves stock, and so the preferred series, and usually every series of stock will have protective provisions. So they'll all have the ability to approve or not approve liquidation of the company, creation of another security, the same rank for senior. Let's see, any security convertible extra, unless the same ranks junior, so no senior. So they can actually block a financing, block a Series B, because you can't, in this one, you can't create the higher liquidation preference share. I've never seen these. I don't think I've ever seen these exercised or argued about. They're pretty standard, and rarely see protective provisions in our term sheets negotiated. If there's a sophisticated attorney on the other side of the table, they're just very industry standard. First time you read them, it sounds very kind of intrusive. Well, you're not. Let's see. Oh, you're not going to sponsor digital tokens or cryptocurrency. Well, that's not a problem usually. So let's go to the next one. Purchase or redeem or pay any dividend prior to this, any capital stock prior to the Series A receiving a dividend. So you can't dividend out, just like the options. The management can't give themselves dividends. Adopt compensation plans that are different. Usually it's increased salaries, change the number of people on the board. The one thing that you have to go back very often for approval is there'll be a limit on the salary that you can pay management. That requires a board approval, but that seems pretty logical. If you're an executive, that the board approve the salary, it seems pretty logical. Like I said, I've never seen anybody really fight over these issues, but they're very standard. So let's go to anti-dilution provision. So anti-dilution is if you do a round at a lower price. So I paid $1 a share to buy shares in your company, and things don't go great. The economy tanks. We need to raise money, and we raise money at 80 cents a share. I get some additional anti-dilution consideration for that, and it's quite complicated. The calculation's sort of complicated. One way of doing it is called full ratchet, and it means I just get my shares essentially repriced at the new price. That's pretty extreme, especially if the down round is a bit more. Say you just need a little bit of money at that new price. I put in $10 million, but we need $2 million, and we have to take it at a lower price. It doesn't really dilute me all that much, but I get all of my shares repriced. That's not really fair. And I full ratchet is thing that is a red flag we'll talk about later. This formula sort of balances it out and gives me something based on the amount of dilution that I actually suffer. And I'm not going to go into the calculation of it, but it's there are a couple of variations of this. They're all pretty standard. The lawyers can argue over the details, but although they rarely do. But this can be really important in a down round scenario. It always exists. Nobody gets rid of anti-dilution, and it's almost always one of these sort of weighted average calculations. So if you see this, it's important, but it doesn't change, and no investor is going to give this up. So down rounds are not friendly sometimes to founders. although they're not good for investors either. So we're going to go down to pay to play. Anybody know what a pay to play is? Pay to play means that if the board decides to issue stock, that they can force the investors to participate. I put a red flag on this one because I would never agree to it as an investor. If I want to participate, I participate. If I don't, I don't. But and occasionally you do have a pay to play, but it's rarely called out in the documents. You have to agree to it. The majority of the board would agree to it in a certain situation and say we're going to force everybody to participate. And if they don't, we're going to convert all their preferred stock to 1/10 of a common stock or something like that. So this is actually doesn't really affect the founders of the comp, but it's very unattractive to smaller investors. Larger investors might want to put it in so they can force the smaller investors to participate, or maybe they get diluted and that benefits the larger investors. So I would avoid anything like this because it may limit the kind of investors that you can get in later.
Particularly for the early rounds, because what happens is those early investors or angel and seed investors can't follow on the larger rounds. What it's really doing is it forces them to convert to common if they're not participating at their pro rata.
Yeah.
I.e. at the percentage that they own, which is probably a larger percentage at the time that this clause gets enacted.
Yeah. And a lot of times this pay to play, if you scroll down, let's see the bottom of this. Any round, see this word down is the key word here. Any down round would out invoke a pay to play. And the problem is for smaller investors, of course, is down round means your company's struggling. There's some question mark about viability or it was overvalued. And it's a huge risk for them where a large fund can just stomp on them. So I would say take care of your small investors or give yourself the ability to get small investors or investors that might not like this term by just avoiding it. Yeah.
So thank you very much. It's very interesting. So I think for us who are not used with this term,
Sorry?
I think for us who are not used with all these terms, legal terms and lawyers, I think it's good if you can put on a deck or send us a document in which for each of these points you give us few advice
Okay.
how to approach it. Because this is far too technical web service for us. So pay per play. Do this or do that.
Well, I am. I'm telling you, take some notes. Take notes. Okay?
No, it's good if you're right.
All right.
Because with
Well, I may take this and mark it up, but
a little more practical.
okay, so let's go to the next. My goal is not to tell you what to do, because you need an attorney to talk through this. My goal is to tell you how VCs think about it.
But we will
Okay.
not go to the maybe the signature.
Yeah. Yes.
And then the pay play and capital call, same thing, right?
What?
Having a capital call, building a capital call, same thing. And we,
I don't know. Capital call is something VCs do, but I don't know how a company does a capital call.
okay, this is like the second round of the company, like where the company makes it.
That may be a term that, that I'm in your previous world or somewhere else, but yeah, I guess it's equivalent of what you're talking about is like a partnership has a capital call. Yeah.
If you don't participate, then you know.
There's some punishment for not participating. And usually in this, the punishment is, death of your stock.
Yeah.
Off with their heads. So it's not good. So let's go through some other terms. The other terms that I was sort of surprised to see this. This is sort of recent, the CFIUS terms. If you're taking money from an overseas investor, you have to do a filing with the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. It takes time. There's a whole bunch of structuring and costs associated with it. And if you have your lawyer will be right on top of this, but Sarah and I have been through this, and you can spend a lot of money with investors that think you shouldn't file this and you think you should, and then you're going back and forth. This is a very complex area, the CFIUS. I'm not going to tell you what to do on it, other than if you run across it, you need good counsel to help you make decisions. So let's go, keep
Can
going.
you just highlight real quick the possible penalties for not filing CPs?
Well, the penalty is
Real
often, I think is rescission. I think is they can unwind the deal, but it isn't like you have to give them money back. I think that they can just take the equity back. It's really worse for the investors. But, investors out of, I think the focus has really been on investors out of China because of technology transfer and data transfer. If you're getting clinical trials, you're getting a lot of individuals, and it has to do with if they control the company, et cetera. It can be kind of a mess, but I would say if you're waiting for a term sheet you get a term sheet from domestic investor and you're waiting for one from overseas, recognize that the overseas ones will have this risk, so that you might, unless all things being equal, you might prefer the domestic investor rather than have the structuring risk and the time risk associated with this. Does everybody know that the company, if I invest in your company as a VC, you pay my legal expenses? Everybody knows that? It seems, when I first heard that, I thought, that is so unfair. That is so wrong. But the truth is, the VCs are set up not, that's how they're set up. That's how their economics work. They're not trying to make you pay for their rent or their bonus or their golf membership. This is pretty standard. You put a limit on it, a reasonable limit on it, and your attorney can help you. And typically for Series A financing, I see $30,000. It might have gone up in the last few years, but sort of $30,000, $40,000.
Yeah. Question. When does this kick in? Like in the negotiating, surely that's not.
No, at closing.
But no.
And if you don't close, you don't pay.
Okay.
So, and I've seen ones that say, oh, if we don't close, you still have to pay for my legal expenses, but I'm not, that doesn't give you, everybody's got to have some skin in the game.
Yeah.
So I would absolutely say no. Look, it's all a matter of degree of, how much you need the money, but given any options, I would be really wary of a VC that said you're paying my legal expenses no matter what. However, if they said you have to do this experiment so that we can reconfirm that your technology works and it's going to cost us this much, and we're going to do it during this, early, before pre-investment or during this time, which kind of timing may or may not work, I might agree to pay that back or take a note or something where they get compensated for it, because but the legal expenses on a loan deal is built into the VC model, that we pay the legal expenses on a deal that blows up. And to some extent, this gets to their commitment. If they're in the high commitment, zone of 95% of our term sheets closed, doesn't really, they're not going to negotiate this. If they have a lot of deals blow up and they walk from a lot of deals, they might negotiate it. So I rarely see this anything other than subject to closing. But notice this is in parentheses, so maybe it's an optional term here.
You should be worried that they're not going to be negotiating good faith, though. They're trying to get you no matter what.
Yeah.
Really, the reason you have to pay for it is it just moves the accounting from the VC side to company side, which hopefully it's enough money, it doesn't feel like it's that painful. But like VCs only make 2% of whatever the fund is. So actually paying for these legal fees can add up quite a lot.
Okay, investors' rights agreement. I don't even read this section. To be honest, this is for the attorneys. This is what happens if you your IPO, demand registration, all the forms you fill out on IPO. My view as an early stage fund is that later stage funds are going to clean this up and do it and fix anything that's wrong with it, but it's all pretty standard anyway. And my attorneys look at it, but frankly, it's not something that I spend any time on. And I don't think it really matters too much to entrepreneurs. Your attorney might want to tweak it, but it's really not a big deal. For early stage. For later stage, if you really might IPO, it is. So up. Okay, information rights. As an investor, if I end up, I start on the board as a Series A investor. But if you do a Series B and you've got 3 or 4 big funds, there becomes so many people in the room. I might be pushed off the board, and I might have an observer seat, but I might not. But what I will have is in my investors, my limited partners in my fund actually require me to do this, is get a management and information rights letter that basically says, you'll tell me enough that I can report to my investors about annual, quarterly, and monthly financial statements. We don't ever ask for monthly, but quarterly, yes. And other information like the cap table and the budget a year, sort of yearly, end of the quarter update, capitalization table. I really, as a VC, I have to have that information because I've got to report to my investors every quarter. How much do I own? What's changed? What major things have changed in the company? And it doesn't have to be a bunch of super secret information, but this is very standard. As an investor, I want the right to participate in future rounds. So that's really important. If a large investor comes in, I don't want to be shut out from an investment, especially at an attractive valuation. So I want to be able to keep up my percentage. Now this has always been a little bit puzzling to me because it says major investors. That's usually the definition of investors that own a certain number of shares. Typically doesn't include the common investors because often the founders aren't really going to participate in the financing in a meaningful way, although I would say they're always welcome. Shall have a pro rata right based on their percentage equity ownership to participate in subsequent issuances of equity securities. And then if they don't purchase, if that major investor doesn't purchase it, the other major investors have the chance to scoop it up. So this is a standard term, you're not going to change it. What you would have the opportunity to do is to discuss this major issue. Do you want to participate? Do you want your small investors to be able to participate? Do you care? What defines a major investor is the one thing that you can decide as a CEO. And I think I like the idea of letting all investors participate, or at least unless you've got hundreds of investors, in which case it can be kind of it can be a hassle. But otherwise, you're not really going to change this pro rata right. What I don't understand is if a new investor that isn't a current investor comes in with a term sheet to have a certain investment, this doesn't really account for the fact that they have already taken a big chunk of it. But everybody's motivated to. Usually, the pro rata is the pro rata right of the remaining part that new investor doesn't take. And then it's between your current investors and the new investors. If the current ones want to invest a bit more, then you can let them push back and forth to figure out who's going to how you're going to divide up the amount that's going to be raised. Let's go. I don't usually see non-compete agreements in the term sheet. I think non-compete agreements are kind of old school. I have seen some that say that will define a standard employment agreement that everybody has to sign. That basically says there'll be a very limited non-compete in that agreement that says you won't work for a company that's going after the same target or something that's really close for a period of time. But this is more important to me is everybody has to sign this agreement that basically assigns all the patents, IP to the company. And as an investor, I've had it happen to me twice where I don't know why it happened the second time. I just should have been more attentive where the CEO didn't sign this agreement because they were responsible for getting everybody else to sign it. And then they weren't obligated to keep things confidential after they left. Kind of a hassle. So as a investor, I'm heavily incented guys to make sure everybody has to sign this, so I don't have to chase them down the street about confidentiality or patent rights. Employee stock options. So, yeah,
So, I mean, if you sign this contract, if the CEO will let go at some point, what would the company or the investor do? They will-
the CEOs let go.
Yeah,
What's the question?
so the CEO will not, cannot do any company doing similar things?
Oh, well, it has to be, first, non-compete agreements are not really are kind of unenforceable in most places that are very broad. So it has to be very narrow. So if I said, if you're working on I don't know, PD-1 targeted drug, maybe I could say, I could put in the employment agreement for 1 year, you won't work on a PD-1 targeted drug, or you won't work for, hematological cancers, or something kind of narrow. But that's not narrow, but something narrower than just everything at biotech. And this is non-compete, so it's only things that compete with your original company. So if you leave, whether you're fired or you decide to leave, you take a lot of knowledge with you. As a VC, I'm kind of unhappy if you go stand up a new company the next month and you've had some great idea that you didn't share with the current company. So it's a sort of slow down. I view it as to slow down bad behavior, which would be, oh, I had this idea, but I didn't tell the company because I knew I was going to leave and I wanted to start a new company. But the truth is, you had the idea while you worked for this company. I think there's a reasonable discussion to be had about that, but it shouldn't stop you from being an entrepreneur. It shouldn't stop you from working for other companies or even starting a new company. It could be a different target, doesn't compete. But I would say in biotech particularly, I've done it where it's target related, so that and it's only a period of time, so that if you, it could even be target using this type of construct. So you have a particular type of antibody construct. So it could be pretty narrow, and I think that's very negotiable for a scientist that might have a lot of interest. You could thoughtfully narrow that in discussions at this stage. Say, okay, great, I get it, but here's what we're doing, and this will stop me from doing things that are directly competitive with the company, even though it might be going after the same indication. Make sense? Yeah.
So I have a question. So the non-compete agreement stops you from being an employee or starting a new company. How about the consult?
How about what? Same thing. Yeah, you can't go, you shouldn't be able to help another company that's competing either. Same thing. Look, deal with these up front. If you're, like I said, I've seen scientists that have very broad interests, then they sort of narrowly agree to something. It's only a year. And if you can't narrow it enough that you could do a lot of interesting things in that year, I think a thoughtful discussion about how that impacts you, or how that might limit your ability to make a living with the investors is absolutely fine. I mean, I think the investors would totally get it. If you said, hey, look, I want to be, if I'm ever not with the company, if you fire me, I want to be able to pursue some of my other, pursue other ideas. Let's make this fairly narrow. I think that's a reasonable discussion. Yeah.
How we see those entrepreneurs who have done multi-business that kind of in a similar area, that they start a new one.
How do they feel about it?
No, basically they kind of start a new one in an area that is partially competitive with the previous one.
Yeah.
Will we see ever check their history of entrepreneurship and think about this behavior? How do you see things about that?
Well, maybe,
care.
but if their first company is doing well, you might say, hey, this is okay. Now if they left, and it's more about how you leave, right? If they left and said, I want this company to succeed, I'm doing everything to try to make it succeed, but I am working on something different, no problem. a bitter, divorce, where you're trying to destroy your old company, I might wonder about is that going to happen to me as an investor?
And
So it's how you do it. And so I think that we'll talk a little, I'm going to talk a little bit about this, but I'll go ahead and do it now. We've sort of broached the topic of you may be the initial CEO, but then in the future, you might not be with the company. I think that, I think it's best if the founder stays with the company. And I think that most of the time, if they can, but I see a lot of people blow it because they stay in the CEO seat too long, and they're not great at it, or they're just not suited to where the company gets to. In almost all companies that we invest in, there's a CEO that gets it going and gets to a certain point, and then there's very few Bill Gates, that take it all the way, own a big chunk, and many times there's sort of handoffs. And I have very few examples of founders that hung on tightly to the CEO seat that stayed with the company, but I have examples of founders who said, hey, it's time for me to take another role in like a chief science officer. They can stay on the board very often if they're adding value. Everybody wants them there. But I see them kind of burning bridges and personal relationships by staying on too long and fighting to be CEO. And that's too bad because I think it weakens the company. So I'm sure that you've had the talk of, is everybody really a CEO? And I'm not even sure CEOs are that fun of a job. I mean, being chief science officer, let somebody else get fired. We have one company that just had an exit after, it was one of our fund one companies. So it was a software company. It must have been 15 years. And the founder, who was the CEO when we funded it, was there and on the board the whole time, but it went through 4 different CEOs. They did a good job for that stage, left or got fired, and then another one came, and they got to say and see the whole thing, influence the company, and it was, I think, a really good thing for them. So I think that's and a lot of VCs will have that approach. Some VCs will broach this topic with you of, do you want to be CEO forever? And I don't believe what you tell me, because some people will say, "Oh no, I'm good. Replace me whenever," and then the founder will totally resist it and totally burn all the bridges, trying to do things that they're not used to doing. So I would just encourage founders to think about how much more fun life would be not being CEO, because CEOs can be hard. Okay. This is just CFIUS stuff. We're going to skip that. Okay, this is what I talked about. This is often so the board of this company is comprised of 1, the lead investor, 2, the representative designated by the remaining investors. So investors get a couple of board seats, the representative designated by the common stockholders. And so that's your seat if it sits here, but I don't always see that. A lot of times I will see the chief executive officer representing the common stockholders, the current chief executive officer, and that's you, the founder. But then if you're not the chief executive officer, you become. So I think the other thing I would say about this is something we'll talk about in a second. How are we doing on time?
30 minutes.
Okay. We'll talk about balanced board. So I think it's real important to have a balanced board, which could mean you and then 1 investor and an independent that you both pick. So sort of balanced, an independent view. If you're powerful enough, you've really gone a long way without investors, and you're super sexy company, you might get away with a founder-dominated board. And if you're super early, it might end up being an investor-dominated board. But as an investor, I don't care, because the minute the board starts voting differently, I've had it happen a handful of times in 20 years, the company's in trouble. So people have to figure out how to get aligned and stack hands. I think it makes everybody feel kind of comfortable and creates an atmosphere of fairness and a balanced discussion to have a balanced board. So I like that idea for almost all companies at the start. ultimately, it'll be more VCs than anything else. And then after the VCs, you'll start recruiting industry experts and people who will take it public or non-investors perhaps. Then they'll dominate. But at the start, I think balanced is good. Let's skip the drag along. We don't need to talk about that. Okay, here's a big issue. You own 100% of the company. After I invest, and there's an option pool, you own 50% of the company. However, half of your stock is going to be restricted, and you're only going to get it if you stay a certain amount of time. And if you leave or you're fired in the next year, you might lose 15% of your 50%. And that's sort of, that can throw a lot of entrepreneurs because they suddenly feel like they don't own their company. But as an investor, I'm investing in you. I'm not investing in your technology. I'm investing in you, and I need you to stay around. And this is one I've seen founders choke on, and they hate it. But I think on every company I've invested in, I would insist on it. I'm not interested in a situation where the founder says, "Hey, I'm frustrated. I'm done. I'm taking my stock. I'll look forward to a check later. I'm going to go start my other company, my other idea, like you talked about earlier. And thank you. I want a incentive for them to stick around or a penalty if they leave early." Yeah.
So this revesting, is that, I mean, that's pretty standard in what you're seeing now, this
Absolutely.
requiring the existing founders and employees to revest.
Yeah. Casey, have you seen anybody? Have you done any deals where you didn't have founder restriction? No, would never. Okay.
That's been around for 2 or 3 years.
Oh, well, that's different. If you're a later stage, there's often that already exists. The founder may already, so there may be some still vesting. Founder may have additional options because they got certain amount of dilution and you gave them additional options. Or you're just sort of past that period where the founder leaving is going to create a company. So it's really the first round where I see this happening. I don't tend not to see it happening later unless it didn't happen in the first round. Okay, let's scroll. And we talked about the term sheet expiration. That's just a date to make you come back. You don't have to panic over that. Okay, let's go back to the slide deck here, and we'll talk about.
Chris here. So looks like it's absolutely necessary to have a lawyer to look at those term sheets.
Yeah.
What is it? Where we can find that?
You need to ask around and talk to someone, other entrepreneurs, and maybe VCs. I think other VCs can recommend lawyers that know what they're doing. As I said, I'm not interested in lawyers that do some VC financings. I'm only using lawyers that do all VC deals. You know, that's 100% of their work is in venture capital. Because big corporate lawyers that have, I've done some VC deals. I've seen it, they'll kick it down to an associate that hasn't done it. They'll mark up things that don't need to be marked up and sort of rewriting what documents are very standard. And so you need somebody who understands what the standard documents look like. Our financings all look the same, no matter what firm we're using. Yeah.
So you touched on it a little bit, but from a practical perspective, I wanted to sort of give a comment to folks on the conditions of closing, because sometimes going through reps and warranties, audited financials sometimes, your IP needs to be well organized, or you're going to talk to the tech transfer office at the university, and you may have lawyers sitting down with those groups to walk through that, and it can sort of take time and be a lot of effort that folks, if they're not having done it before, don't realize that there's a lot of things that go into checking the box on the legal and IT diligence, financial diligence, and so I think it's worth sort of highlighting that it's not just you got your term sheet and you go through with the lawyer, they sign off, and the provider goes through it. It's there's some work on the back end that you
there is, and I will say I've seen a few situations where first-time CEOs let the lawyers get out of control, and the cost will be. I had one that Series B was I think it was $200,000 worth of legal work on our side where it should have been $50,000. And because the CEO was not controlling the big West Coast, fancy VC oriented, you would recognize the name, law firm. So, but you or your investors can kind of help you pick one, and then, make sure you can understand the cost. Say, hey, this is our budget. If you're going to go over it, you need to tell me. If there are things that are sort of new, that unexpected, we need to talk. So, but like you said, there's a lot, the reps and warranties, preparing all the final documents. So bad terms. We talked about all these: full ratchet anti-dilution, cumulative dividends, partial liquidation preferences. We didn't talk about it, but redemption. I don't think redemption in 5 years. If you haven't sold the company, we have the right to insist on our money back. We just don't. We never do that. I haven't seen that by any. It might happen in a later stage deal, but not an early stage deal. And then tranche financings. We didn't talk about this, but a lot of VCs have. And again, this sort of depends on the risk and the economic environment, but have financings where they put money in as you hit milestones, and those can be worked out just fine for the entrepreneur. But if they don't fund, there should be an adjustment in the control. They shouldn't get to keep their board seat if they only put in part of their capital. They should have to back off the board or something. If they decide they don't want to be in the company, then it has to have an adjustment in control. So we could spend a lot of time talking about tranche financings, but I think there used to be a real allergic reaction to them by entrepreneurs, but I've seen more of them over the last 10 years than I did over the first part of my career, and I think I haven't seen any of them. I've never had one blow up. And in fact, I think we've funded every one we've ever done. So let's go to the next slide. The problems for entrepreneurs see during this process is too much focus on modest valuation differences. Instead of thinking about recasting the deal. The entrepreneur needs to own more, get a higher agree to maybe they'll take a higher valuation if they can put in a little bit more money, or consider the plan. We're not going to go through it, but the cap table I sent you, the cap table document, look at that and see, maybe it doesn't matter that much. I've seen people arguing over valuation differences that once you show them the numbers of how much it actually affects their ownership at the end, they say, well, that doesn't matter. Yeah, you're right, that doesn't matter. So sitting down and looking at, here's what I think where the company will end. This isn't a score on your R01 grant or anything like that. It's worth doing the modeling and figuring out, does this valuation difference matter? Difference between $10 and $12 million may or may not matter, depending on how much you're raising and what the capital trajectory is. Founders that are stuck on control, we talked about balanced board. We've had founders that negotiate everything. Usually on these term sheets, we find that experienced entrepreneurs focus in on a few issues. They don't rewrite the template. They don't rewrite the protective provisions. Pick and choose two or three things that you want to negotiate and work on those. And don't get too bogged down if possible, if it's a reasonable term sheet. Founder refusing stock restrictions, we talked about that. And then if you don't respect the confidentiality no shop, the deal blows up. We've walked from deals when we've discovered that somebody's shopping it and sharing our terms with others once they've signed a term sheet. I really only happened once, but it's actually amazing. It's only happened once. But let's go to the next slide. So things that you need to take into consideration. Once you take the investor's money, the shareholders own the company. It is not your company. It is shareholders' company, and you have a lot of responsibilities. It really does change things, and an entrepreneur has to be prepared for that. We're investing in you. We have never made an investment where we thought this person's a bad founder. We just want to get in and run the company. That is way too much work. Nobody wants to do that. So they are investing in you, but you can change their opinion and during the negotiations by being difficult, and then they don't want to invest in you. And that's the reason term sheets can fall out. You can fall out the term sheet. If someone gives you a term sheet, even if you don't like the terms, it's a compliment. They like your company. and you don't know what's going to happen in the future. They might come back with a different deal. You might decide this is an okay deal. So you can always say, no, thank you. This is not right for us right now. And if you do it right, you build a relationship that might be useful in the future. And the last thing I've learned is take the cash when you get it. We've never had a company that I've said, oh, darn, I wish we didn't do that funding round. So hard to walk away from, although we did. We walked away from 2 deals with Courier because they were really crappy deals that we had no, we pretend the terms were just bad. They weren't these standard terms. So let's, we talked about the model. Did anybody play with the model that I sent? Okay, what'd you learn?
Both of them. Oh, I love the model, no matter what.
Yeah.
Yeah, what I learned from it? Actually, what I didn't learn, I thought the boundary stock stayed much stronger than I thought it would go a different race.
You thought it
I
did?
thought it stayed stronger, yeah.
It was worth more at the end than you thought.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to build $1 billion company, and if founders own 10% or 5% at the end, that's a win.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was really good. I mean, I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, like I said, if I go through it here, nobody can see the numbers. But if somebody plays with it and gets stuck or something, send me a note, and I'm happy to talk about it. But I think it's really illuminating for people to see where you have this very subjective reaction to valuation, for instance. But then if you plug it into a model and you say, yeah, it reduces my return, my personal return from 30 million to 27 million. However, I want to work with these people, and it's higher probability of success because they're good, or I have a good relationship with them. It totally changes the way you think about the valuation.
Yeah, I think he's, think percentages. I don't think you will think percentages at that point.
Yeah.
You think that the achieve the size of those numbers as they go along further to the right, you realize that your actual valuation, first valuation, bigger.
Now, the trick though is run that model with a down round in it. It gets ugly. That's the danger for entrepreneurs, really, I think, is the down round. As founders, you get squashed, and it's hard to recover from that. So, go ahead.
Dan, could you help us understand how does the valuation work? Because we all have seen Shark Tank, right? And founders come in and say, hey, I'll give you 10% of my company for $10 million. And then they're like,
Next slide.
they're like, no, it doesn't work that way. So who drives the valuation? How does that work? What are the dynamics and things to consider? And why do VCs look at it in that way? And what is it that founders need to consider when they listen to what the VCs or investors have to say, right? So how do you reconcile?
Well, I think every fund may be different, but there's no sophisticated discounted cash flow model for valuation, right? It's based on what we see, comps in other similar companies with similar risks. This is an interesting article by a friend of mine, Scott Lynette. I hate the title of it, but it really, the summary is, value is your company is worth nothing, but nobody's going to pay you the same thing as a pre-money valuation for it. I don't think. I mean, most of the companies, they're worth nothing really, but we're willing to bet on the upside. So it's basically, it's the risk-adjusted opportunity to create a big outcome. Okay, so you can increase your valuation by lowering the risk, or by making the opportunity look big, or by having a bigger opportunity. You may not be able to change that, but those two things affect how you look at the valuation. So, yes, in the back.
Valuation is just to set ownership percentage.
Sorry, it's just what?
Just to set ownership percentage, that's all.
Yeah, and VCs come in, they have a model for how much they need to own. And very often this is driven by the fund. So fund size, I'm going to invest in so many deals. I've decided that I should own this much of the company, and that will generate this much return for me in the end if I'm right. And it sets that percentage. I think that's a reasonable way to look at it. And so if a fund has a model of owning, we got enough for. We invest $10 million in all in per deal, and we do $5 million up front, and we want to own 30%. then they're gonna set valuations around $10 million to own the 30%. You know, but, now, I will guarantee you that they'll deviate from that. If you see a really good deal, you'll pay more. A serial entrepreneur, something that has lower risk. All of you guys have giant markets, so I don't know if the market size is like price of poker. You gotta have big markets. But the lower risk, you know, closer to the clinic, if it's a therapeutic, can give you a higher valuation. Serial entrepreneur, somebody who's good at raising money. I'll tell you what, a big risk in my mind is the company's ability or CEO's ability to raise money. I can't raise money for a CEO. I tried, it looks stupid, you know, like, you know, here's my CEO. Let me tell you the story about the company. Makes them look terrible. They've got to go raise the money. Not me, not Casey. They've got to raise the money. And their ability to raise money is an important risk factor in the whole equation. So if you go back, let's see, what else do I have on that? Yeah, and VCs aren't bargain shopping. You lower your valuation to very low. It's not, you know, we've only got in a fund. How many companies do you invest in a fund, Casey? 18. That's a lot, but a lot of that's sort of high end probably. A lot of funds are 10 or 12. You don't, and you do that over 3 or 4 years. I'm not going to take a bargain deal. I'm going to take the slots for the high quality opportunities. So if VC wants to invest in you, they're probably, you know, they're probably driven, their valuations are probably driven by how they view the risk adjusted opportunity and how their fund is set up to think about percentages and amounts of investment. So that's, if you don't have to read this article now, that's really what that article is about.
So, I mean, I agree with that. The valuation is determining the share. But on the other hand, if you have a high valuation, you get more bonds, you can get the company doing faster or more efficient. I mean, does that also affect how you?
Well, the high valuation, you let you get the company going fast.
Or cash might not.
Yeah.
But high valuation, you know, in fact, a too high valuation, you get high valuation for an unsophisticated investor, then we're thinking, you know, I have to come in, I have to tell these people they have to do a down round. I've walked away from opportunities because I didn't want to deal with that headache of doing it, you know, hey, your valuation is too high, we're going to have to do a down round. Or I've told companies that and they say, well, no, we can't do that because our investors will never agree. It's so you can get way over your skis in valuation if you're just trying to maximize valuation.
Can you expand on that? When you're talking about those early investors and then they don't want to do the subsequent rounds because the valuation was too high. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, you mean how can they block it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth, because I think it was all sort of implicit in the documents and such, but maybe people make sure.
Well, and the protective provisions and of this particular NVCA term sheet, the current Series A investor had the ability had to approve a new series class of stock, a Series B, that would have superior rights. So you would be stuck unless that investor wanted so in some sense, you know, if you have an investor who's irrational and gives you a really high valuation, higher than what other investors would give you, are they going to behave rationally when it comes to raising more capital? Depends. You know, ultimately they will, but you might lose a lot of time on that. Or I've been in with investors that say, no one will give us this money, so okay, we'll do it, but here are our terms. And there, you know, there's always some catch to that. So a realistic valuation gives you more room to maneuver and get the investors that you want and need for the next round.
So with some of the early stuff, right, where it's kind of made up, or we hear what we, you know, it's hard to really pin a true valuation. But in my experience, I see, you know, maybe this, like if it's an early stage company, preclinical, maybe just out of a lab, this, that. I mean, how far from like say 5 million would you say, like pre-money, which I know it's individual, but in most cases, I see people.
Yeah, well, I think there's a I personally think there's a minimum. When we first started, we did some at like $2 million pre, and it was too dilutive to the founders and over time, and it wasn't the right thing to do. So, but I want to own a certain percentage, like Casey said, and at that low level, at the relatively modest valuation, VC could say, okay, yeah, fine, but we want to put in a little bit more, so we own. This is really a little seed round, and a lot of times you can get those done with debt, and you can push that off. Let's talk about that for a minute. A lot of people want to push off the day of reckoning on valuation by taking a safe note or a bridge note, which is fine for some amounts of capital. But as it gets larger and larger, it can become problematic. One, you can have caps in it that sort of create a situation where your new class, your Series A, when your new investor comes in, they may put all the new cash in, and then all the other cash is spent, but the old investors own more of the Series A than they do. That's kind of a problem if I'm looking at it, and that can be solved structurally. But I think letting your bridge or your safe note get too big is I think it can create a challenge for a company.
The reason why I bring it up is I do talk with a lot of other founders who are, I'm out raising and I want to do 2 million, like 10 pre or 12 pre, and then I kind of, I tell them I think that's going to be really challenging trying to get capital at that price. But my data is good, my science is good.
Well, the biggest problem I think most of you biotech companies, the biggest problem with $2 million is going to get you to an important milestone. And so what's the next round? What's the justification for the value at the next round? It's probably no better than the first one. It's a little less risk, but it's still not clear. So that amount of money is you either do it at a modest valuation or you do a note and try to get to a price round. But avoiding the price round forever is I think that's step. Sorry.
Can I ask a follow-up question about your convertible debt? Having a valuation cap in there as a VC doing the next round after a company has already taken on some convertible debt. I don't know how to phrase it. Where is kind of the break point for you that it's problematic? Like if they're only getting a 20% discount because of that valuation cap versus say a 50% discount. Does that make sense?
Depends how big it is. If it's $100,000, they don't really care.
Right.
But if it's a significant portion of the new class of ownership, I care because they'll have some control over that class, and I care who it is, and that'll affect how I think about it. But also, if that money is largely spent, I'm thinking, well, maybe it shouldn't be the same class if they get just a giant portion of it. So I don't know. I think optically and emotionally, it kind of becomes an issue when it starts to be 30% of the new round or so. But I don't know. Casey, do you have an opinion on this? Do you care?
No, I think there's optics to it. I think at the end of the day, it goes back to what you said earlier. Every fund's got a certain financial thesis that they pretty much got to follow. How much I need to own, that kind of stuff. And so if you do the math and it works out, fine.
Yeah, but it means that what it means is Casey has to own his, 80% or whatever you guys own these days. And then that bridge note is additional dilution. So it drives your funding to be larger, but might not drive your valuation to be higher. So make sure you're getting value out of your bridge note, because you have to justify a higher valuation to account for it, right? So otherwise you should just do a price round and do a modest price round, and in that way, if you think about it, if you take your $5 million example and you go raise $1.5 million and find an investor who's willing to do that and take that chance, they're taking the chance that you don't go up in valuation, and they're kind of in the ride with you. So I kind of respect that from the investors, that they're fully in, and they're going to suffer the same kind of, they're going to suffer dilution just like you. Yes.
So is the valuation affected by the stock market? So for example, 1 year ago, maybe it's $1 billion similar company, but after 1 year, maybe all of the stock market goes to half or one. So the valuation of the same company will be changed.
Yeah, stock market matters, I think. I think because everybody's looking at it and they venture investors know that, a lot of, especially the later stage investors could invest in public companies that are at half the price. And that sort of trickles down to the earlier stages and how you look at your risk of raising money. And I think valuations have been a little bit high, frothy over a period of time. So I think most VCs have the view now that they're sort of reverting back to a more normal level. So I don't know how it's going to play out, whether we're going to have a shortage of capital or there's just plenty of dry powder and it's going to be slightly depressed, slightly different valuations. But it does, I think it does have, we're seeing an impact.
It's a supply and demand problem.
Sorry?
It's sort of a supply and demand thing, because the valuation is sort of the price of your company. You're gonna have to do multiple rounds as you get to those investors that can also do public.
Yeah.
Or pipes or whatever. There's less demand for your product because they got all these bargaining stuff. So it's just the old laws of economics.
Yeah, we were sort of supercharged by a lot of things, including the fact that hedge funds and later stage investors could invest in private companies, take them public, maybe through a SPAC, which is sort of on the outs now too, and make a lot of money. So we're driving private. There was a big pull at the end of the financial supply chain. So you got affected early valuations positively. So that's not there so much anymore. Anything else?
We're right out of time.
Sorry?
I said we're right out of time.
Okay. Well, anybody has any other questions?